Before the battles that would define a nation, there was a gathering of rebels, a plan for independence, and a leader thrust into command. But the road to revolution was far from simple. These were not seasoned soldiers or official leaders, just a handful of men daring to make decisions that could change history. George Washington, a man with a reputation for defeat, was given command. But could he unite farmers and merchants into a force ready to face the might of the British Empire? From desperate negotiations with France to the freezing wilderness of Canada, the Continental Congress faced impossible odds and fierce division. Will this untrained army stand a chance, or will the dream of independence die in the fields outside Boston?
Is this everyone?
Stay tuned as we pick up where we left off and see how close America came close to completely unraveling. In part 4 of the America Begins series, we will learn about legendary stories like King George's taxation overreach on the colonists, the Boston Tea Party, and the Olive Branch Petition. Alright, let's get started. In 1767, the British once again managed to upset the American colonists yet again. Big surprise there. I mean, if you thought modern governments knew how to tick people off, wait until you hear about these guys. This time, many colonists were already grumbling about things like the crackdown on smuggling back in 1763. Smuggling was practically a national pastime for some of them. Oh, and don't forget the infamous proclamation line of 1763, basically the colonial version of, "Sorry, no new land for you." Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which was just about as popular as a parking ticket. Protests, boycotts, and the usual colonial temper tantrums eventually forced Parliament to repeal it. But, plot twist, they were about to make a comeback. In 1767, a guy named Charles Townshend, who ran Parliament, decided that just because the Stamp Act was gone didn't mean the British couldn't still mess with the colonists' wallets. Enter the Townshend Acts. These new acts slapped higher taxes on things like lead, paint, and, wait for it, tea. Now here's the thing, the colonies weren't exactly prime real estate for growing tea. So this little hike in tea prices hit the colonists where it hurt the most, their caffeine fix. It's like when Starbucks suddenly doubled its prices after President Biden's Green New Deal, people started getting pissed off. Predictably, the colonists weren't having it either. They figured the British were trying to pull another fast one like, oh great, here we go again, Parliament's reaching for our wallets. It was too soon after the Stamp Act drama, so tensions were high. Cue the protests, elites encouraged the masses to start boycotting British goods again, and things got violent. The poor tax collectors were once again public enemy number one, but this time it was the guys handling the import duties who were in the firing line, literally in some cases. The situation was especially bad in New England. This was an area full of smart folks, all hopped up on Enlightenment literature. Think of them as the colonial version of today's well-read, politically active hipsters. It didn't help that New England was also a major hub for commerce. The new taxes really hit their bottom line, so it was both an intellectual and financial revolt. So how did they respond? Smuggling, of course. If the British were going to tax their tea, paint, and lead, then the colonists would just figure out creative ways to get their hands on it under the table. Classic move. But in 1768, things took a serious turn when the British decided to send soldiers to Boston. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? It's just some soldiers. But try to picture this in modern terms. Imagine tanks rolling down your street and soldiers in full body armor standing guard outside the post office. It'd be like a scene from The Last of Us, minus the zombies, but still terrifying. That's what the people of Boston were dealing with. These British soldiers were rocking their iconic red coats. which might seem comical to us now, like nice outfit, bro. But back then these weren't just funny-looking uniforms. These soldiers represented control through force. To the colonists, seeing soldiers in their streets felt like military rule was coming to their doorstep, and that was not what they were used to. Up until then, they'd been governed by their own colonial assemblies, but now it seemed like the king and parliament were sticking soldiers in the region to enforce their will. And as tensions mounted, groups like the Sons of Liberty started talking about gasp independence from Britain. But to be fair, in 1768, most people thought that was crazy talk. You could travel up and down the colonies, and very few would be on board with the idea. Even in Boston, where things were especially heated, the majority still thought splitting from Britain was a wild idea. But they sure didn't like British soldiers on their front lawns. So, when British troops landed in Boston, Parliament and the King probably expected the colonists to calm down, right? Like, okay, we'll just park some soldiers here and that'll keep things in check. Spoiler alert, it did not. Instead of scaring people off, the presence of these redcoats only cranked up the tension. As these soldiers stood outside the customs house, the locals didn't shy away. Oh no, they'd walk by, hurl insults like, "Hey, lobster back." That's right, because of those fancy red uniforms. They probably threw in a "hey jerk" or two for good measure, though I'm not sure jerk was in the colonial vocabulary. And this is a family-friendly story. Sorry, we'll keep the colorful words aside that I'm sure they truly said, but seriously, lobsterback was a favorite. Picture this, soldiers just trying to do their job, escorting the tax collectors, and colonists would walk by, heckling them. Definitely not what the British government had in mind. The protests kept growing through 1768, got even worse in 1769, and by 1770, things were really heating up. In early 1770, a group of soldiers was stationed at the customs house, their job being to protect the money collected from taxes, because, tax money was important to the British, even if it was causing all this drama. These young redcoats, just doing their job, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a mob, and this wasn't just a few angry folks, we're talking hundreds of protesters. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The soldiers were just kids, like 18, 19 years old. Most of them had joined the British Army for a paycheck, and boom, they get shipped off to Boston. To these guys, Boston wasn't just any city. It had this rep as a place full of religious fanatics. Puritans, right? It probably felt like they were being sent to live in a place where people were still getting scolded for not wearing enough black. So it's March 1770, and these soldiers are standing there already on edge from the daily insults being hurled at them. On this particular day, it goes from words to snowballs, and not the fun, fluffy kind. Colonists start wrapping rocks inside the snow and lobbing them at the soldiers. Then it escalates to just straight up rocks. At one point, a soldier gets hit in the head by a rock, blood pouring from his head wound, and he collapses. Now remember, these are young men surrounded by a massive crowd. Hundreds of people shouting at them, throwing things. At this point, the situation is getting real intense. Imagine being a 19-year-old redcoat halfway across the world, getting pelted by snow-covered rocks and hearing people in the crowd shout things like, "Fire! Go ahead! Fire at us!" What do? Well, these soldiers, already feeling trapped, decided to do exactly that. They opened fire on the crowd. Now, before you judge them too harshly, put yourself in their shoes. They're outnumbered. They've just seen one of their own knocked down by a rock, and they legitimately feared for their lives. When they fired, they ended up killing 5 colonists. And with that, the so-called Boston Massacre was born. You might be thinking, wait, 5 people? Isn't that more of a skirmish than a massacre? Well, leave it to the colonial press to put a spin on things. The media in Boston jumped on the term massacre Like CNN comparing January 6 to 9/11, it was breaking news. They made it clear, look, these British soldiers are killing your neighbors now. This isn't just about taxes anymore. Your government is straight up murdering people. So yeah, things just got very real in 1770. Up until then, it had been boycotts, protests, and some tarring and feathering, which was more of an extreme prank, really. But now there were actual casualties. The Boston Massacre marked a turning point. This wasn't just colonial grumbling about taxes anymore. This was blood on the streets. Now, after the Boston Massacre, there were definitely some mixed feelings. Some colonists and even the media were like, wait a second, maybe we've gone a little too far with all this protesting. You know, kind of like when you're yelling at customer service and realize maybe the person on the phone isn't the one who invented the terrible return policy. A few colonists started wondering if maybe they were escalating things too quickly. Meanwhile, across the pond, the British Parliament was thinking the same thing. Maybe we're squeezing these colonists a bit too hard, like we don't want to accidentally start a revolution or anything. So even though independence wasn't exactly a hot topic in 1770, both sides were getting the vibe that they might want to pump the brakes. In response to the Boston Massacre, Parliament decided, okay, maybe we need to chill out. They pulled the troops out of Boston, thinking the redcoats were more like a fire starter than a fire extinguisher. And to keep the peace, Parliament even allowed the 8 soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre to go on trial. Yes, in Boston, right where all the drama went down. In a twist you probably didn't expect, guess who defended these British soldiers? None other than future founding father, future president, and all-around responsible adult John Adams. That's right, Mr. No Taxation Without Representation himself stepped up as their lawyer. 6 of the soldiers were acquitted and 2 were convicted of manslaughter. Those 2 got off with just a branding on their hands, which sounds a bit like getting a bad tattoo, but still, this was the 1770s version of, we'll let you off with a warning. Now, as part of their effort to not push the colonists over the edge, Parliament also decided to repeal the Townshend Acts. Well, almost all of them. They got rid of the duties on lead, paint and paper, but they kept the tax on tea. Because apparently, even in the 18th century, tea was just too important to mess with. So both sides were like, alright, let's cool it, and things settled down for a bit. From 1770 to 1773, it was a relative period of peace, like the awkward silence after a huge family argument where no one wants to bring up the topic again. But like all awkward silences, this one was about to get interrupted. Enter the Tea Act of 1773. Parliament passed this thinking, hey, this one will be a win. The colonists are going to love it. Spoiler alert, they did not. The Tea Act wasn't even aimed at the colonists directly. It was basically Parliament trying to bail out one of their favorite companies, the British East India Company. Think of it like a corporate bailout, but instead of too big to fail banks, it was a company that specialized in, you guessed it, tea. The British East India Company had a special deal with Parliament that let them grow tea in British-controlled India and then sell that tea exclusively in England. So, the tea you were drinking in England in the 1770s probably came from India, packed and processed by workers there, shipped back to London, and sold to eager tea drinkers. It was a whole operation. Meanwhile, most American colonists were sipping on tea that wasn't exactly legal. They were buying smuggled tea from Dutch traders because, you know, it was cheaper. So the Tea Act was supposed to help the British East India Company by giving them a monopoly on the colonial tea market, which Parliament thought would make everyone happy. They figured, hey, cheaper tea for the colonists. Who wouldn't love that? Well, as you'll see, it didn't go down quite as they'd hoped. Alright, so the British East India Company, a big tea company only licensed to sell in Britain before 1773, suddenly faces a very good problem. In the early 1770s, all of a sudden, they had an overflow of crop production in tea leaves, which was way more than usual, and they were excited by this until they realized they've got nowhere to put it all. Their warehouses are overflowing, and with tea practically stacked to the rafters, they're looking at a crisis. Now, tea doesn't age like wine. Let it sit too long in those damp warehouses and it'll get moldy, stale, even ruined. They've got to move it or lose it. So the company takes their tea troubles to Parliament in 1773. Hey Parliament, can you help us out? Parliament's like, alright, we see an opportunity here. Their big idea? Let's open up the North American colonies for British East India Company tea. The colonists can get it super cheap, maybe 10 cents on the dollar. Not literally, but you get the point. And it's a win-win-win situation. The company makes a little cash instead of taking a total loss. Parliament gets the Townshend duties on each shipment, and even after adding the tax, the tea is still so cheap that colonists won't even care. It'll be a bargain for them, so everybody's happy. Right? Well, not exactly. There's one group that isn't thrilled, the smugglers. Since the Townshend Acts slapped duties on tea, American smugglers had been bringing in tea from the Dutch East Indies, making a pretty penny. Now, with British East India tea flooding the market at rock-bottom prices, these smugglers stand to lose big, but smugglers aren't the only ones who feel like they're getting tricked. The colonists look at this deal and see something fishy. In their eyes, it's a British scheme to crush local smugglers, forcing everyone to buy British tea. And just wait, they're sure prices will go right back up once British tea has a monopoly. They see this as a bait and switch, a setup, a Trojan horse of tea. So how do the colonists respond? Well, 1773 rolls around and they're angry like, oh, you're forcing us to drink this cheap tea? Violence breaks out. They're back to tarring and feathering customs collectors, just like during the Townshend Acts of 1767, and there's a story, maybe more legend than fact, that colonists boiled up tea, forced duty collectors to drink it, a sort of revenge tea party of its own. From the British standpoint, they couldn't figure out why the spoiled brats in the colonies didn't just buy the cheap tea and be happy. What they didn't realize at the time was that it was cutting into the income of smugglers. Smuggling was a way to help the colonists make ends meet, kind of like a side hustle.
Is this everyone?
So, the anger against British tea doesn't just stop at a few protests. Nope. There are boycotts all over the place, and soon enough, people start calling for full-out boycotts of British East India Company tea. It's like, it doesn't matter if this tea is cheap or not. Don't buy it. Stick with the smugglers, which feels a bit like support local businesses, colonial edition. They didn't want to fall for what they saw as yet another British trick. And it wasn't just talk. Some people decided to get rid of British tea altogether, even if it meant illegally disposing of it. Enter the famous tea parties happening across the colonies, but the strongest protests and boycotts, that's all centered in Massachusetts and more specifically in Boston. New Englanders had an independent streak, big on Enlightenment ideas and a little anti-monarchy, if you know what I mean, and Boston's plan, go big or go home. The Sons of Liberty decided to pull out all the stops. Local councils across Massachusetts, kind of like town hall meetings, but without the colonial governor snooping around, met to decide how they'd handle the Tea Act. The verdict: destroy the tea. Don't let a single leaf hit the market. So, on December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and Dr. Joseph Warren, along with some folks from around the area, marched down to Boston Harbor, and no, they weren't taking British East India Company ships. They went for whatever local ships happened to be transporting the tea. The mission: dress up like Mohawk Indians and dump the tea before it can even be sold. And dump it, they did, 90,000 pounds worth of tea straight into the harbor. Now that's 90,000 British pounds of tea. We're talking a small fortune here, but it also happened to be close to 90,000 pounds of literal tea leaves. Of course, with such a massive spectacle, myths start swirling. One popular tale was that Boston Harbor tasted like tea for a month. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But there is a grain of truth. So much tea was dumped in the water that it floated above the surface. You could see it just sitting there, mocking the crown. Now, an interesting detail here, the colonists who did the dumping dressed as Mohawk Indians, complete with feather headdresses and leather outfits. Why? Well, at this point, indigenous tribes like the Mohawks weren't seen as a direct threat in Boston, so they'd taken on a sort of noble freedom symbolism in New Englanders' eyes. Mohawk attire represented liberty, untamed and free from Britain's control. The headdress, in particular, became a kind of freedom emblem, one that colonists embraced as part of their rebellion. Anyway, back at Boston Harbor, these Mohawks tossed an unbelievable amount of tea overboard in what would become one of the biggest acts of rebellion yet. King George? Well, he's about to have a strong response. Let's just say this party wasn't ending without consequences. Alright, so we're now in early 1774, and word finally reaches England about the chaos unfolding in Boston. King George hears about the destruction in Boston Harbor, along with the ongoing violence against his officials, and let's just say he is not amused. He's sitting there thinking, I fought a whole war to protect these colonies, rid them of the French, and borrowed massive sums to do it, with British taxpayers footing the bill. And how do they repay me? With protests, violence, and dumping loads of tea in the harbor? Imagine for a moment if today a state just up and decided it didn't like a certain tax, started assaulting postal workers, and destroyed federal property. It's a serious level of rebellion. So, in King George's mind, Boston's protesters are something like outlaws or even terrorists. And honestly, he isn't wrong to think that Boston is at the heart of it all. From the Boston Massacre to aggressive protests after every new tax and duty, Boston has been a constant thorn in his side. To him, the people of Boston have turned into spoiled brats who, every time they don't get their way, throw a temper tantrum and make life difficult for everyone, and so King George decides it's time for serious consequences. A make an example out of them moment. He's ready to lay down the law to show the other colonies what happens when you mess with the crown. This brings us to the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists would come to call the Intolerable Acts. Up until now, King George had mostly left the handling of the colonies to Parliament, but not anymore. He's now directly involved, telling Parliament, "You're not doing enough, it's time we set things straight." So here's the rundown on these coercive acts, which were essentially 4 harsh measures aimed squarely at punishing Boston. Closing Boston Harbor. Boston's port is shut down to all trade until the tea destroyed during the Boston Tea Party is paid for. And it's not just the big port itself that's closed. There are British warships set up at its mouth, making sure that no ships can sneak in or out. For Bostonians, this is a massive blow because without trade, their economy is going to be seriously hurting. Quartering Act. British troops are sent back into Boston to maintain order, and this time locals are required to house these soldiers. So, you've got redcoats back in town, right where the Boston Massacre happened, and now they're staying in people's homes. It's like adding fuel to an already blazing fire. Massachusetts Government Act. Boston had a lively town meeting culture, which was how they organized their protests and resistance. This act effectively bans town meetings unless explicitly approved by the governor, meaning that Bostonians can't freely gather and strategize against the British. Administration of Justice Act. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies would now be sent back to Britain for trial. The colonists saw this as a free pass for British officials to act however they pleased without facing consequences. To King George, this all seems perfectly fair. He's thinking, behave, or this is what happens. The colonies, however, see it differently. As word of these intolerable acts spreads, a sense of unity starts to form across the colonies. Other colonies see Boston's punishment as a warning shot aimed at them too. If the British Crown can just shut down an entire port, force citizens to quarter troops, and crack down on local governance, well, what's stopping them from doing the same elsewhere? And so, instead of frightening the colonies into submission, the intolerable acts actually push them closer together. A new phrase starts to echo across the colonies. An injury to one is an injury to all. What King George intended as a show of force to quell rebellion is now fanning the flames of what will become a full-blown revolution. The intolerable acts have now hit hard, with the British government fully clamping down on Massachusetts. Let's recap the new rules here. Boston Harbor is shut down. No trade until the British East India Company is reimbursed for all that lost tea. No town hall meetings without a British official present, and none in Massachusetts at all. British soldiers are stationed back in Boston to maintain order. The General Court of Massachusetts is effectively dissolved, with the British appointed governor now wielding all the power over the colony's laws, taxes, and infrastructure. The impact of these moves is staggering. If you're a merchant in Boston, your livelihood just tanked. You can't easily switch to another port without a major loss in profits, and many tradespeople and dock workers are staring down financial ruin. Meanwhile, British soldiers back in Boston feel like an invasion of your own city. And now, instead of self-government, it's military rule and a royal governor making all the decisions. So, what's the colonists' take on this? They're furious. This hits especially hard for people inspired by Enlightenment ideas who already feel uneasy about unchecked authority. The concept of a monarch or his representatives having absolute power over the colony flies in the face of what they believe is fair and just governance. This outrage is reflected in political cartoons of the time. One famous piece shows Lady Liberty, dressed in a Native American headdress symbolizing freedom, being force-fed tea by a British officer. It's dark and visceral, implying that the British are violating colonial freedom itself, almost as though they're holding Lady Liberty hostage. The unrest isn't confined to Boston or even Massachusetts. The colonies are now connected by a shared anger and a real fear that what's happening in Boston could happen to them next. For many of these colonies, this is the moment they start to see their fates as intertwined. So what happens next? Colonial leaders start reaching out to each other, realizing they need to band together. It's almost like a network of alliances forming, with elites from each colony writing letters, sending messengers, and spreading the word about what's happening. You can almost picture the conversations. "Hey, Steve in North Carolina, it's Joe in Virginia. You heard about Boston? It's getting out of control, man. If the king can take over their government, what's stopping him from doing the same to ours?" These discussions are leading up to a major decision. It's time for a united response, and so, in 1774, the colonies plan to convene their First Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial representatives to discuss this new crisis. It's an unprecedented move, and it'll bring delegates from across the colonies to Philadelphia. They aren't yet talking about independence, but they're meeting to figure out how to stand against these new British impositions. So, we're in 1774, and colonial leaders, wealthy, influential figures from across the colonies, meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They're gathering to figure out how to respond to the harsh measures Britain has imposed on Massachusetts. This is an assembly of merchants, lawyers, landowners, some colonial assembly members, and prominent voices in the colonies. Think of it as a powerful mix of early American influencers, like George Washington from Virginia, who was a war veteran from the 7 Years' War, and other notable figures from New England and beyond. When these guys get to Philadelphia, the opinions on how to respond are split. Some are so angered by the treatment of Massachusetts that they're already talking about taking up arms and pushing for independence, but at this point, most attendees think that's extreme. Instead, the general consensus is to use the same tactic that worked before: economic pressure. Key actions of the First Continental Congress: boycott British goods. They decide on a total boycott of British goods, encouraging colonies to stop buying British imports and exporting American goods to Britain. It's a familiar strategy they'd tried before, and they believe it could force Britain to reconsider. Send a strongly worded letter to King George. They draft a petition that spells out their grievances and demands. It's a formal letter that argues the colonists' rights to life, liberty, and property, and it condemns the coercive acts as oppressive. The letter essentially says, "King George, what you're doing to Massachusetts is unfair. We demand that you repeal these laws, remove the duty on tea, and let things return to the way they were in 1763. Plan to meet again in a year." Believing that King George will likely do as Parliament has done in the past, backing down and repealing oppressive laws, they decide to reconvene in a year. Many hope that by 1775 they'll be celebrating in Philadelphia, with tensions eased and colonial grievances addressed. With their plan set, they disperse. Delegates head back to their colonies, telling people to join the boycott and wait for the king's response. They feel certain that this will bring resolution, just as the Stamp Act protests did. But little do they know this time, the British response will be far different. What happens next? The letter makes its way across the Atlantic and lands on King George's desk. But instead of the expected concession, King George digs in his heels. He doesn't see the colonists as petitioners with legitimate concerns. He views them as rebellious subjects who need to be shown who's in charge. This dismissal will only intensify colonial unity and deepen the resolve of those who are increasingly ready to go beyond protest. The stage is set for a historic shift. As tensions simmer, the colonies brace for what will soon become a full-scale conflict. The clock is ticking toward revolution. Picture it: King George, ensconced on his throne, warmed by the crackling fire, receiving the letter from the First Continental Congress. He scoffs at the colonists' demands, dismissing them as if they're just the complaints of a handful of unruly elites. To him, this isn't a unified stand. It's just more of Boston's disease of rebellion spreading like a virus to infect the rest of the colonies. He's not going to let this made-up ragtag Congress threaten British authority. Instead of backing down, King George decides to send a firm message that defiance will not be tolerated. He calls upon General Thomas Gage, a seasoned soldier with deep experience in the colonies, a man who's balanced in temperament and familiar with colonial society. But Gage's orders are straightforward: end the growing unrest, capture the ringleaders, and confiscate any weapons that could fuel an armed rebellion. Gage's arrival in Boston. So, in 1774, General Gage arrives in Boston, accompanied by 4,000 British soldiers. They begin to occupy the city, setting up to locate and neutralize those responsible for the unrest. Gage's mission isn't to terrorize the colonists. He's there to re-establish control, though his presence sends a clear message. Colonists who had once protested taxes and laws in defiance of Britain now find themselves under military occupation. One of Gage's priorities is to disarm any groups contemplating open rebellion. For this, he targets colonial arsenals, locations where weapons are stored for emergencies, such as attacks by indigenous groups or invasions, the latter of which hasn't been an issue since the end of the 7 Years' War. Concord, a town just outside of Boston, holds one of these arsenals, and rumors circulate that several outspoken colonial leaders are hiding there. April 18th, 1775. The March to Concord. On the night of April 18th, 1775, Gage decides to act decisively. He dispatches a detachment of 1,000 soldiers, intending to march under cover of darkness to Concord. Their mission: arrest the rumored independence advocates and seize the weapons stored in the Concord arsenal. But Boston's underground network of patriots is alive with anticipation, and they're not about to let Gage's men catch them off guard. Unbeknownst to Gage, Paul Revere and other colonial writers have set up a signaling system to warn of British troop movements. The famous 1 if by land, 2 if by sea lanterns hang in the Old North Church, ready to alert Revere if British soldiers attempt to cross the Charles River by boat, the midnight ride. As Gage's men set out, Revere and his fellow riders speed through the dark countryside, spreading the alarm. The British are coming. Villages and farms stir to life. Local militia, known as Minutemen, begin to assemble, grabbing their weapons and preparing to confront the incoming British forces. In towns like Lexington and Concord, these Minutemen have already heard of Gage's plans, and they're ready to defend their arsenals. This midnight ride sets the stage for the opening shots of the American Revolution. Gage's well-intentioned mission to keep the peace by removing weapons and arresting instigators will, ironically, be the spark that ignites the very conflict King George is so desperate to avoid. Soon, British soldiers and colonial Minutemen will face off in the early morning light, not yet knowing they're about to start a revolution. So, Paul Revere, who, despite looking nothing like Jack Black, is a key pro-independence figure, sets off to warn Concord of the British troops' impending arrival. He's aware that if the British seize the weapons stored in Concord, it'll be a major setback for those advocating independence. Under the cover of night, he begins his famous midnight ride, alerting other pro-independence households along the way, likely saying something like, "The regulars are coming," instead of "the British are coming," since they all still considered themselves British subjects. As Revere makes his way out of Boston, he's joined by Samuel Dawes, another patriot with a similar mission. Both men are riding with a sense of urgency, and word spreads quickly. The alarm network set up by the Sons of Liberty does its job well, and more people learn of the British advance. Enter Dr. Samuel Prescott. Before reaching Concord, Revere and Dawes encounter Dr. Samuel Prescott, who just happens to be on his way home after a late-night visit. Prescott is a local and knows the countryside well, and when he hears their purpose, he eagerly joins their mission. The three of them now ride together, intent on ensuring the weapons are hidden and the people of Concord are warned. Captured. Unfortunately, the trio doesn't make it all the way to Concord together. British patrols are stationed along the roads, and they intercept Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. In the chaos, Dawes manages to escape by turning his horse back toward Lexington, while Prescott, using his knowledge of the area, leaps over a fence and slips away to continue the mission. Prescott will become the only one to reach Concord, successfully spreading the alarm and ensuring the weapons are hidden in time. As for Revere, he's detained and questioned by the British, but is eventually released after they determine he's not a direct threat. By this point, though, the alarm has already rippled through the countryside, and the Minutemen are beginning to mobilize. The Minutemen gather. The early morning hours of April 19th, 1775, find the Minutemen, colonial farmers, tradesmen, and everyday citizens who have pledged to be ready at a minute's notice, gathering on the green in Lexington. The British troops, marching steadily toward Concord, arrive at Lexington to find this small, determined force waiting for them. The British commander orders the Minutemen to disperse, and for a tense moment, both sides stand face to face, neither willing to fire the first shot. But then, suddenly, a gun goes off. No one knows from which side. This shot, heard round the world, sparks a brief but fierce skirmish, leaving several Minutemen dead or wounded. The British troops continue their march to Concord, unaware of the challenges awaiting them. battle at the North Bridge in Concord. Upon reaching Concord, the British troops split into smaller groups, with some going to secure the weapons depot. By now, though, Dr. Prescott's warning has given the Concord Minutemen enough time to hide the munitions and assemble a force at the North Bridge. As the British tried to secure the town, they're confronted by a growing number of armed colonists. Tensions rise once more, and a second exchange of gunfire erupts, resulting in casualties on both sides. Realizing that they're now outnumbered and deep in hostile territory, the British forces begin a hasty retreat back toward Boston. But the Minutemen aren't letting them off that easily. The retreat to Boston, a running battle. The British retreat becomes a grueling 16-mile journey back to Boston, with colonial forces harrying them every step of the way. Minutemen fire from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings, turning the British march into a desperate fight for survival. By the time they reach the safety of Boston, British troops have sustained heavy losses and are shaken by the colonists' resilience and tactical advantage. This bloody retreat marks the beginning of an all-out conflict, and what had started as a covert mission to seize weapons has now escalated into the start of the American Revolutionary War. Alright, so here we are with these regular farmers turned militiamen gathering in Lexington to meet the British troops. They've been warned by Revere, Dawes, and Prescott, who completed the midnight ride. As the colonists wait for the British to arrive, tensions are high, but there's also a sense of excitement and, well, liquid courage. Many of them hit the tavern for a bit of pre-battle preparation, bragging about how they'll stand their ground and keep the British from reaching Concord. So it's the early hours of April 19th, and these militiamen are lined up, a bit bleary-eyed and rowdy, definitely not a traditional military unit. Now keep in mind, these aren't trained soldiers, they're farmers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen with guns who don't have battle experience. They've shown up to defend their town, but they're up against British regulars who are hardened professional soldiers. Just as dawn breaks, the British troops appear on the horizon, marching in formation toward Lexington Green. At this point, the militiamen probably realize the gravity of what's coming. All their talk about kicking butt starts to fade as they see the intimidating line of British soldiers approaching. The British commander, Major John Pitcairn, orders the colonial militia to disperse, seeing them as nothing more than a ragtag group of civilians standing in the way. For a moment, both sides hold their ground, neither willing to start an outright fight. And then it happens. The mysterious shot heard around the world. To this day, no one's certain who fired first, but that single shot breaks the silence and sets off the fighting. The British soldiers open fire and the colonists respond, but it's a chaotic, brief skirmish that leaves a few militiamen dead and wounded. The remaining militia scatter and the British press onward, continuing their march toward Concord. While the British advance, Prescott's warning has allowed Concord's residents to hide the weapons and munitions. When the British soldiers arrive in Concord, they split up to search for the stores, but they're largely unsuccessful since most have been stashed out of reach. Meanwhile, colonial militiamen from the surrounding towns are gathering in greater numbers. They position themselves at North Bridge in Concord, waiting for the British. Tensions are high again as the two sides stare each other down across the bridge. And then, just like in Lexington, another gunshot rings out, sparking the second major skirmish of the day. This time, however, the militiamen force the British back, delivering a clear message that they're ready to resist the long, bloody retreat. Realizing they're outnumbered and vulnerable, the British decide to retreat to Boston. But the Minutemen aren't about to let them off so easily. As the British march back along the same route, colonial forces engage them in a brutal running battle, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings along the way. The British suffer heavy losses, and by the time they reach the safety of Boston, they're battered and demoralized. This day of skirmishes marks a turning point as what began as an attempt to seize weapons becomes the beginning of an all-out war for independence. From this point forward, there's no turning back for either side. As the British soldiers approach the militiamen, they try to play it cool. "Good sirs," they say, likely with all the politeness they can muster, "please step aside." But the colonists? They're not budging. They stand their ground, probably throwing in a few choice phrases like, "Go to hell, we're not moving," and then we get this standoff. Now, historians aren't exactly sure what happens next, but one theory? Picture this. Maybe one of the militiamen, who's had a bit too much to drink, stumbles out of an outhouse somewhere. He's groggy, still figuring out what's going on, maybe says, "Hey, what did I miss?" trips, and his gun goes off. Bang! Well, that's all it takes. The British hear the shot, assume they're under attack, and the redcoats, professional soldiers as they are, quickly level their muskets. They fire into the crowd, hitting 8 militiamen who were just standing there, and just like that, 8 Americans are down, and the British continue their march toward Concord. But here's the thing about this skirmish at Lexington. That single volley is going to change everything. With 8 colonists dead, the survivors rush back home, pounding on doors and probably saying things like, "They killed more of us, just like the Boston Massacre." Picture one guy barging into his cousin's house yelling, "They got Cousin Johnny." People who'd previously shrugged off all this independence talk, now they're fired up, they've lost friends, neighbors, maybe even family, and as word spreads, more and more of them decide they've had enough. The once undecided are now picking up their own guns to join the cause, so yeah, we'll be seeing more of them soon. Meanwhile, back with the British soldiers, around noon, April 19th, they finally reach Concord, exhausted, only to find nothing. Thanks to Samuel Prescott's midnight warning, everyone's cleared out and all the weapons, gone, buried somewhere safe. The British commander has no choice but to give the order to turn around and march back to Boston. Now let's think about this from the British soldiers' perspective. They've been marching for hours, probably close to 14 by now, and guess what? It's another long march home. Exhausted and tired, they head back toward Boston, but almost immediately after leaving Concord, they start running into trouble. Turns out news has spread like wildfire. People who hadn't cared much about independence before are now ready to shoot at any redcoat they see. Here comes Bill, who heard about his brother Tom getting killed, and now he's got a musket in hand, taking pot shots at the soldiers. Same with Steve, who's suddenly all about the independence cause after what happened to his cousin. As these British soldiers march back, they're met by farmers, blacksmiths, and carpenters, ordinary folks armed and firing from behind trees, fences, anything they can hide behind. See, the British soldiers are used to traditional face-to-face combat, but these colonists, they're pulling guerrilla tactics. By the time the British soldiers spot where a shot came from, the colonist who fired is already halfway down the road, setting up for another attack. And what happens next is this: the 1,000 British soldiers who marched out all confident in the morning. They start getting picked off one by one all the way back to Boston. So, the British survivors, what's left of them, start the long march from Concord back to Boston. And as they go, it's not exactly a smooth trip. More than 300 colonists, regular townsfolk who've suddenly turned into sharpshooters, start following them, taking pot shots from behind fences, trees, and whatever cover they can find. And these aren't soldiers in fancy uniforms, they're just regular guys who've had enough of British rule and are now making life pretty miserable for the redcoats. By the time the British finally make it back to Boston, late on April 19th, the situation is rough. General Thomas Gage, their commander, meets with them like, "Wait, where's the rest of you?" And what happened? And the British soldiers, exhausted and wounded, have to admit they didn't get the weapons, didn't make any arrests. Instead, they managed to turn an entire countryside against them. As word spreads, even more colonists decide it's time to stand up to the British, and these pro-independence folks start flooding in from all around, heading straight for Boston, where they intend to surround the city. Gage, now stuck with about 3,600 British soldiers in Boston, watches as around 15,000 colonial militiamen, farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, you name it, start to form a massive blockade around the city. Now Gage has some support from the sea, but he's essentially trapped on land. The colonists have taken up solid positions all around Boston, even down on this little peninsula here, blocking any escape routes by land. If Gage tries to march his troops out, they're going to take heavy fire from the militia, who have Boston essentially sealed off. So what started as a simple mission to confiscate some weapons has spiraled into a full-on siege of Boston. As April turns into May and then into June, Gage is still stuck. And by this point, he's facing a tough choice: break out of Boston or stay put and risk starving out or being overrun. He's thinking, well, if I can just clear these pesky colonists out of their positions on Breed's Hill over there, maybe we can make a break for it. But the problem? Breed's Hill is high ground, and the colonists are already dug in, firing cannons at any British supply ships coming in. By mid-June, Gage has made up his mind. It's time to attack. If he can take Breed's Hill, he might be able to bring in more supplies and maybe even break the siege. So, on June 17th, 1775, 2 months after Lexington and Concord, he sends his remaining soldiers across in boats to remove the colonists dug in on the hill. Now here's the thing about attacking Breed's Hill. It's, well, a hill. The British soldiers have to march up it, which gives the colonists a serious advantage. As the redcoats make their way up, the colonists are firing down with a clear line of sight and a perfect angle. It's one of those times you'd think the British would say, hey, maybe attacking uphill isn't the best idea, but orders are orders, and so they begin the infamous Battle of Breed's Hill. So as the British soldiers start their uphill march, they're about to face something a bit worse than cannonballs. The colonists have not only managed to snag a few cannons from the Concord arsenals, thanks Samuel Prescott, but they've also loaded them with all kinds of nasty surprises. Instead of standard ammo, some of these cannons are packed with chopped up horseshoes and bits of scrap metal. And as the redcoats march up in neat, disciplined lines, they're getting torn apart by a spray of these makeshift cannonballs. One line of British soldiers marches up, gets mowed down. Another line marches up, same result. And so on. The British, not once to back down, try several times to take that hill, with each wave getting hammered harder than the last. Imagine it like one of those GIFs where the British are like, we're taking this hill, ouch. Okay, for real this time, ouch again. But eventually, the British do manage to capture Breed's Hill, only to realize it was a hard-won and incredibly costly victory. Though they technically won the Battle of Breed's Hill, which, due to a mix-up, most folks know as Bunker Hill, the British lost a whopping 1,000 men. For perspective, the colonists lost just over 100. And even though the British took the hill strategically, it didn't help them break out of Boston. The colonists simply set up their positions higher up the peninsula, and Gage was no closer to escaping the siege. Essentially, Gage traded 1,000 men for not much at all. This disastrous outcome would cost Gage his job, and soon after, command was passed to William Howe, a British officer who'd been serving under Gage. The British higher-ups were like, Gage, you had one job, and it wasn't to lose this many troops for one hill. And with Gage sent packing, Howe was left with the same problem, still trapped in Boston with no real way to break free. One fascinating outcome of the Battle of Bunker Hill, though, is that among the colonists were a few enslaved individuals who fought courageously alongside their masters. Although New England didn't have a large slave population, Partly because cash crops didn't thrive up north, and also due to Puritan ideals against it, some slaves were still present. Now, after seeing slaves fight heroically, many colonists, especially those who were heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas about equality, started to question the morality of slavery itself. Here they were, talking about all men are created equal while fighting for freedom from British oppression, and suddenly it was hard to ignore the irony. In the wake of Bunker Hill, we start seeing a push in New England toward emancipation. In some cases, enslaved people who fought for the colonies were promised their freedom, setting an early precedent that would eventually spread to the northern colonies where slavery wasn't economically crucial. So Bunker Hill wasn't just a rallying point for independence, it also sparked one of the first serious discussions on freedom for all. They're not exactly hopeful King George will go for it. By this time, things have spiraled way beyond just taxes or duties. You've got armed conflict, a siege in Boston, and now these colonial delegates in Philadelphia are scrambling to hold everything together. They know they're not all on the same page. Massachusetts is all in for a fight, but the other colonies are wary, and some of them would prefer to patch things up if they can. So while they send off the olive branch petition, which is kind of a desperate last plea to avoid all-out war, they're also hedging their bets by taking steps that seem a little contradictory. Alongside the petition, they start organizing the Continental Army. Yep, as they're writing to King George, all sweet and peace-loving, they're also saying, just in case, let's get an army together. They know they can't just rely on random militias, so they officially decide to form a unified force and appoint George Washington, a Virginian and a veteran from the French and Indian War, as its commander. Having someone like Washington, an experienced military leader and a Southerner, no less, is a strategic move to unite the colonies under a single banner. It's a big deal because up until now, the colonies have mostly thought of themselves as separate, independent entities. But back to the olive branch petition, King George receives it, and to say he's not amused is an understatement. From his perspective, these aren't concerned citizens making reasonable requests. They're rebels defying the crown. And in August 1775, he issues a proclamation declaring the colonies to be an open rebellion, so that's that. The peace petition is officially rejected, and the colonists have their answer. The king isn't backing down, and now neither can they. As word of the rejection spreads, the mood in the colonies starts to shift even further. People who were previously on the fence are beginning to see that there may be no choice but to break away. And with the Continental Army forming, the push for independence gains momentum. Now it's not just a handful of hotheads in Massachusetts. It's starting to look like a united movement. In just a few short months, the colonies go from frustrated British subjects to rebels at war with their own government. And from this point on, the conflict only escalates, setting the stage for the full-blown Revolutionary War that's about to unfold. The olive branch petition was the last real chance at a peaceful resolution, but with that door firmly shut, there's no turning back. This wasn't just a Massachusetts thing, this is all the colonies together. By picking Washington, they send a message. This fight is something every colony has a stake in, and having a Virginian at the helm helps unify the colonies because it's no longer just New Englanders leading the charge. With Washington, you get a leader from a powerful, populous, and wealthy colony, which gives southern and middle colonies more of a reason to feel involved and committed. Now, Washington's not the ideal candidate on paper. As you pointed out, his record isn't exactly spotless. He faced some tough defeats during the 7 Years' War, including that fiasco at Fort Necessity. But he has crucial experience in European warfare tactics, which most others lack, and he's respected for his character and sense of duty. So they roll the dice with him, figuring that the symbolism and unity he represents outweigh any drawbacks. So, with Washington chosen as commander, the Continental Congress starts working on raising an army. The thing is, like you said, they don't have a treasury, and there's no organized system for paying troops. So they come up with creative solutions. They offer land grants to entice recruits, hoping that the promise of land will get people to enlist. And they make plans to fund the army by appealing to wealthy supporters, taxing and pooling resources from the different colonies. The Continental Army is starting from scratch, so they face a long road ahead. Washington's task will be monumental. He has to turn these raw recruits, who are mostly just local farmers and tradesmen, into a cohesive fighting force, and they'll need training, supplies, and discipline if they're to have any chance against the well-equipped professional British Army. As all of this comes together, the stakes couldn't be higher. The colonies are setting up a government, an army, and a leadership structure, all while still trying to appeal to King George for peace. But deep down, many know they're preparing for the possibility that they'll be fighting for independence. It's a tense, uncertain time with massive decisions being made by a group of just regular guys who've suddenly found themselves in charge of a revolution. They'll no longer be able to pack up and leave when they feel like it. For these militia guys, that's a big shift. They're used to being able to leave whenever they want, whether it's to tend to their crops, go home to their families, or simply because they disagree with a commanding officer. Signing up for a professional army means they lose that freedom. They're bound to follow orders, face danger, and commit for an extended period. Washington's trying to establish a disciplined, trained army, but these militiamen have a very different mindset. They're fighting to defend their homes, not necessarily to commit to a long-term national struggle. And Washington has to overcome this if he wants to turn them into an army that can go head-to-head with the British. So Washington's working to convince these men, and he knows he needs to offer incentives, land, some pay, or even promises of honor and glory. But it's not just the enlistment period that's challenging. He's also dealing with the mindset of these men. They're not used to the strict discipline of European-style armies. Many of them have never seen the kind of drills, training, and rigorous order Washington intends to implement, and this new discipline feels restrictive, but Washington is determined. He knows that without discipline, his army won't stand a chance. He pushes for a formal structure, and little by little, he begins to mold these militia fighters into something resembling a professional force. And all the while, word is spreading. Across the colonies, people start hearing about this Continental Army forming, the Olive Branch petition being rejected, and that the king has effectively shut down the possibility of peace. The colonies now see that their hopes for reconciliation are gone. They're no longer just in a standoff, they're in a full-blown rebellion, and the stakes are getting higher. Washington is now at the center of it all, pulling together an army from scratch and preparing for what is starting to look like an all-out war for independence. French Canadians could keep their faith and have autonomy over local affairs, especially religious ones. Now, with Washington's men openly celebrating anti-Catholic events like Kill the Pope Day, it's clear that joining the colonies could jeopardize that religious freedom. The French Canadians see this hostility toward Catholicism just south of their border, and it makes them question whether aligning with the American cause is worth risking their hard-won rights and protections under British rule. Ben Franklin's mission is already difficult, but this anti-Catholic sentiment creates yet another hurdle. He has to convince the French Canadians to join a rebellion where they're likely to encounter resentment or even hostility toward their Catholic faith. Ben Franklin knows that without their support, the northern colonies are vulnerable. If the French Canadians decide not to support the colonial effort, or worse, side with the British, it'll leave the American colonies open to attacks from the north. George Washington, aware of how these celebrations could harm relations, tries to put a stop to them. He issues orders discouraging anti-Catholic behavior, reminding his men that they need allies if they're going to have a chance against Britain's military might. But enforcing this attitude is challenging. Many of George Washington's soldiers are used to traditional beliefs and practices that don't align with his inclusive vision. For them, Catholicism is a threat or a rival, something they were raised to distrust. In the broader picture, this issue reflects the colonial struggle to unify the diverse colonies, each with its unique customs, beliefs, and histories. While Washington's vision is clear, bringing everyone together under one banner, overcoming centuries-old divisions, is easier said than done. Ben Franklin presses on in Canada, but he knows it's an uphill battle. Washington continues drilling his army, slowly transforming volunteers into soldiers, while constantly dealing with the social and religious divides that threaten to undermine their unity. As 1775 progresses, both leaders realize that if the colonies are to stand a chance, they need to find common ground and bridge these cultural gaps. For George Washington, that means instilling discipline and tolerance among his troops. For Ben Franklin, it means persuading potential allies that the colonies represent a true alternative to British rule, not just another source of prejudice. Despite the setbacks, both men remain determined to push forward, knowing that the future of the American cause depends on overcoming these divisions and presenting a united front against the British. French Canadians could keep their faith and have autonomy over local affairs, especially religious ones. Now, with Washington's men openly celebrating anti-Catholic events like Kill the Pope Day, it's clear that joining the colonies could jeopardize that religious freedom. The French Canadians see this hostility toward Catholicism just south of their border, and it makes them question whether aligning with the American cause is worth risking their hard-won rights and protections under British rule. Ben Franklin's mission is already difficult, but this anti-Catholic sentiment creates yet another hurdle. He has to convince the French Canadians to join a rebellion where they're likely to encounter resentment or even hostility toward their Catholic faith. Ben Franklin knows that without their support, the northern colonies are vulnerable. If the French Canadians decide not to support the colonial effort, or worse, side with the British, it'll leave the American colonies open to attacks from the north. George Washington, aware of how these celebrations could harm relations, tries to put a stop to them. He issues orders discouraging anti-Catholic behavior, reminding his men that they need allies if they're going to have a chance against Britain's military might. But enforcing this attitude is challenging. Many of George Washington's soldiers are used to traditional beliefs and practices that don't align with his inclusive vision. For them, Catholicism is a threat or a rival, something they were raised to distrust. In the broader picture, this issue reflects the colonial struggle to unify the diverse colonies, each with its unique customs, beliefs, and histories. While Washington's vision is clear, bringing everyone together under one banner, overcoming centuries-old divisions, is easier said than done. Ben Franklin presses on in Canada, but he knows it's an uphill battle. Washington continues drilling his army, slowly transforming volunteers into soldiers, while constantly dealing with the social and religious divides that threaten to undermine their unity. As 1775 progresses, both leaders realize that if the colonies are to stand a chance, they need to find common ground and bridge these cultural gaps. For George Washington, that means instilling discipline and tolerance among his troops. For Ben Franklin, it means persuading potential allies that the colonies represent a true alternative to British rule, not just another source of prejudice. Despite the setbacks, both men remained determined to push forward, knowing that the future of the American cause depends on overcoming these divisions and presenting a united front against the British. Thanks for joining me on this journey through America's early fight for independence. We've only just scratched the surface. Next time, in Part 5 of the America Begins series, we'll pick up right where we left off, diving into the intense moments that shape the next chapter. Be sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
In the dawn's early light, our flags were sown with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the drum beats in our hearts, we chased away